Thank you, Dr. Land, for inviting me here today. I also want to thank Professor Elisa Stone and my husband, Rick Weber, for helping me prepare this presentation. My name is Jessie Fluetsch, and this is Beyond Bathrooms, How Transgender Children Are Changing Our Schools for the Better. So, as I said, my name is Jessie Fluetsch. I'm a proud alumnus of Salt Lake Community College. I've also worked with children who have disabilities, and I'm a transgender man. So what does transgender mean? Transgender is a word that refers to people whose gender identity and biological sex don't match up in the most common way. Some people describe this as being born in the wrong body. That's the language that I most often hear from young children and their families. But it can also be described, as it was by one non-binary activist, as I wasn't born in the wrong body, I was born in the wrong world. Kids Like Me is a playgroup that I started in 2009. For most of the time since then, I've been running it with my husband, Rick Weber. It's a playgroup where gender-creative kids and their families come together in the spirit of fostering acceptance. These are elementary school-age children and their families. Let me tell you why I started Kids Like Me. As I said, I'm a transgender man, and most of my close friends who are transgender have attempted suicide at some point in their lives. There's a lot of pain in our community. It comes from discrimination and harassment. It comes from internalized transphobia, and it comes from many years of not living as one's true self. I see an opportunity for the future for the next generation of transgender and gender nonconforming adults who are children now to have healthier and happier lives. There's been research coming out for a few years now showing that children, adolescents who are transgender, who get medical intervention to halt the puberty that is traumatic for them, instead go through the puberty that feels right for them, grow up to be adults who are just as happy and healthy as non-transgender adults. And for that, our community where there's so much pain, that is huge. There's also research showing that gender nonconforming children and young people who don't fit gender stereotypes but who may not be transgender, when their families, when their parents display fewer rejecting behaviors and more accepting behaviors, their children grow up into adults who are happier and healthier. So I also started Teens Like Us a couple years ago. Kids and Kids Like Me, the ones we started with in 2009, are now in high school. As they transitioned out of the Kids Like Me group, there wasn't anywhere for them to go as far as a support group. The groups of the Pride Center for Youth went through age 20, and I didn't want a 12-year-old in the same group as a 20-year-old because they have very different concerns. So Teens Like Us is a weekly social and mutual support group for middle school age kids where they can be with their peers and talk about the things that are relevant in their lives. All right, so what I've noticed working with young people who have disabilities and working with young people who are transgender or gender nonconforming is that difference in schools tends to work in some analogous ways. The ways in which people and systems respond to difference frequently creates unnecessary handicaps for the person who's different. And I brought a book today, my favorite children's picture book, to illustrate this. It's by Christopher Myers, who's a fantastic author. He's African American, which is important because the majority of kids in the public education system now in the US are people of color, and most of our books feature white characters and don't feature people of color. Wings by Christopher Myers. Look at that strange boy. Everyone from the neighborhood is pointing fingers and watching the sky. How's he doing that? They stretch their necks and shake their heads. Icarus Jackson, a new boy on my block, is flying above the rooftops. He is swooping and diving, looping past people's windows and over the crowd. I don't think he's strange. Icarus Jackson, the fly boy, came to my school last Thursday. His long, strong, proud wings followed wherever he went. The whole school was staring eyes and wagging tongues. They whispered about his wings and his hair and his shoes, like they whisper about how quiet I am. Our teacher complained that the other kids couldn't help but gawk and stare. He said that Icarus's wings blocked the blackboard and made it hard for the students to pay attention. The teacher told Icarus to leave class until he could figure out what to do with his wings. He left the room quietly, dragging his feathers behind him. One boy snickered. At recess, the snicker grew into a giggle and spread across the playground. Soon all the kids were laughing at Icarus Jackson's useless wings. I thought that if he flew just once, everyone would stop laughing. Icarus looked up, flapped his wings a couple of times, then jumped into the air. He swept through the schoolyard like a slow-motion instant replay. But the other kids were not impressed. One girl grabbed the basketball. A boy stuffed the handball in his pocket. Somebody nagged, "Nobody likes a show-off." Their words sent Icarus drifting into the sky, away from the glaring eyes and the pointing fingers. I waited for them to point back at me as I watched Icarus float farther and farther away. Walking home from school, I knew how he felt, how lonely he must be. Maybe I should have said something to those mean kids. I ran through the streets with my eyes to the sky, searching the clouds for Icarus. He struggled to stay in the air. His wings drooped and his head hung low. He landed heavily on the edge of a building and sat with the pigeons. Pigeons don't make fun of people. A policeman passing by blew his whistle. "You with the wings, come down from there. Stay yourself on the ground. You'll get in trouble. You'll get hurt." It seemed to me Icarus was already in trouble and hurt. Could the policeman put him in jail for flying, for being too different? When the neighborhood kids saw the policeman yelling at him, they exploded with laughter. Icarus dropped to the ground. "Stop!" I cried. "Leave him alone!" And they did. I called to Icarus, and he sailed closer to me. I told him what someone should have long ago. "Your flying is beautiful." For the first time, I saw Icarus smile. At that moment, I forgot about the kids who had laughed at him and me. I was just glad that Icarus had found his wings again. "Look at that amazing boy," I called to all the people on the street as I pointed to my new friend Icarus swirling through the sky. So I love that book. It reminds me of some fabulous kids I know, including some fabulous little boys. Icarus wasn't made to feel welcome at his school, and many transgender and gender nonconforming students are also not made to feel welcome at their schools. All children need equal access to public education. That's a right. And in order for them to get that, transgender and gender nonconforming children need privacy. They need equal access to facilities such as bathrooms, and they need to be safe from physical, verbal, and sexual harassment and assault. Unfortunately, they often don't get all of these things. I want to tell you the story of a kid I know who was in the group. We'll call her Elizabeth. And Elizabeth had a disability, and she was in elementary school, and she was a transgender girl. And she was being picked on by older kids in the school. And they wanted to know what her genitals looked like. So they pantsed her on several occasions. So which is, forcibly removing someone's pants. And that's a very severe form of sexual harassment, even sexual assault. And it wasn't treated as such by the administration, unfortunately. This attitude that these older kids had, that they had a right to know this child's genitals, unfortunately is a really common attitude in our society. I've personally been asked on a number of occasions if I have a penis. And kids are asked that too, which I've heard from their parents. It's never appropriate to ask somebody about their genitals, or almost never appropriate, and there's no reason an adult should be asking a child that. In fact, this attitude that transgender and gender nonconforming people's genitals are like public property and should be public knowledge is really behind a lot of discrimination and harassment, violence against transgender and gender nonconforming people. And it's behind a lot of the fear that people feel around bathrooms. I want you to kind of do a thought exercise with me. So if you'd like, close your eyes. I'm going to ask you to imagine that you're 12 years old, you spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week at school, and you don't feel safe using any of the bathrooms there. In fact, recently, A teacher shouted at you in front of your peers for using a bathroom that you thought you belonged in. So you avoid using the bathroom at school at all costs, right? You don't drink water before school. You don't drink water while you're at school. You eat a small lunch. Okay, now open your eyes. Is that an environment where you could learn? Is that an environment where you could focus on being a student? No. But that's the situation that a lot of kids are in today, including in Utah. LGBTQ students victimized because of their gender expression were 3 times as likely to have missed school. This information is from GLSEN, 2015 National School Climate Survey. They're an organization that advocates for LGBTQ youth in America's schools. Victimized students had lower GPAs, were half as likely to say they planned to go to college, more likely to have been disciplined at school, had lower self-esteem, less sense of belonging, and higher rates of depression. So I work with middle school students and elementary school students. A lot of people believe that LGBTQ issues aren't appropriate to talk about in elementary and middle school. But actually, middle school students are more likely to hear homophobic language and negative remarks about gender expression in school than are high school students. They're slightly more likely to be victimized, and they're less likely to have access to some LGBTQ-related school resources that are correlated with healthier and happier children who do better in school. GSAs used to be called Gay-Straight Alliances. They now stand for Gender and Sexuality Alliances. Only 14.5% of middle schoolers have these in their schools. I'm only aware of one in a middle school in Utah, and it was started by a kid while she was in Teens Like Us. 61.2% nationwide high schoolers have GSAs. Middle schoolers are less likely to have supportive educators that they can identify, inclusive curriculum, and comprehensive bullying and harassment policies. So GSAs are really important. When this kid, we'll call her Sarah, started a GSA at her school, it was because she knew there was a need for her and her friends. And there were supportive staff who were willing to help her. And this made her school a better, safer place. Students with GSAs at their schools were less likely to hear homophobic and transphobic remarks at school, less likely to feel unsafe, more likely to experience supportive staff members and to feel a part of their school community. They had improved well-being and academic achievement. They had lower rates of victimization and lower rates of suicide attempts. Lower rates of alcohol use, depression, and psychological distress. So this is correlation, which doesn't prove causation, right? But I don't think you have to be a genius to think that there's probably some causal connection here. But things are getting better, right? This same survey found that there are more GSAs than ever before in American schools. And I see this in Utah too. The survey found that students are being victimized less often based on their gender expression and their sexual orientation than before. And I see this too. Students were more likely than ever before to have access to bathrooms at school and to have access to bathrooms at school that match their affirmed gender identity. And I see this too changing rapidly here in Utah. So things are only changing because people like you, people like me, people like the kids and parents I know are making things better. There's this campaign, It Gets Better. Well, I think it does get better, usually, but only if we make it get better. It doesn't just happen on its own. It gets better because Sarah started a GSA in her school even though it was hard. It gets better because the kids I know have parents who are advocating for them all the time. It gets better because they have teachers and staff in their schools who are making it a better place. It gets better because Salt Lake Community College is building gender-neutral bathrooms and locker rooms in all their new buildings. And that's better for all our kids, not just our LGBTQ kids, not just gender non-conforming and transgender children. When we are in an environment where difference is valued rather than devalued, when children are integrated rather than segregated, and where children are safe rather than victimized, all children learn better. I just have some resources on this next slide for you. PFLAG is a great organization that has chapters throughout the state. If you'd like to reach me, please email me at teenslikeus@utahpridecenter.org. Planned Parenthood of Utah runs a program called Safe at School, where an educator will come into your school and teach administrators and teachers and staff for free about their rights and responsibilities when it comes to bullying and gender nonconforming, transgender, and gay, lesbian, bi, and queer students. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for having me here.